Hello there. How are you tonight? Tucked in, teeth brushed, ready to drift off into a world of questionable hygiene eel feasts, and cod pieces so outrageous they could double as medieval weaponry. Good, because tonight we're not counting sheep, we're counting lice combs, chamber pots, and the number of times someone in the Middle Ages thought sneezing meant you were possessed by the devil. This isn't your average history lesson. It's a sleepy stroll through the strange, the silly, and the slightly stinky corners of medieval life. We'll whisper about bath bands, gossip about garlic-based medicine, and gently giggle at the fact that forks were once considered scandalous. So close your eyes, relax your shoulders, and prepare to be lulled into slumber by tales of fermented fish, breakfasts, and monks sweating through wool robes in July. Because nothing says sweet dreams like a story about communal toilets and chicken armor. Let's begin. Once upon a very unwashed time, in the fragrant fog of the Middle Ages, people had a rather complicated relationship with bathing. And by complicated, I mean they mostly avoided it like it was the plague, which, ironically, they also avoided with about the same success. Now, before you wrinkle your nose in judgment, let's set the scene. Castles were drafty, plumbing was a myth, and soap was more of a suggestion than a staple. The average medieval noble might wear velvet, own land, and command armies, but ask him to take a bath, and he'd recoil like you'd offered him a bucket of boiling frogs. Why? Because water was suspicious. It was believed that bathing opened the pores, and with open pores came danger, illness, evil spirits, possibly frogs. The logic was, if you scrubbed too hard, you might scrub your soul right out. Instead, nobles preferred to layer their cleanliness. A fresh tunic over yesterday's grime, a spritz of rose water over last week's sweat, a dab of lavender behind the ears, just in case someone leaned in too close during a jousting match. Bathing was reserved for special occasions like weddings, or coronations, or the rare moment when someone fell into a river by accident and emerged cleaner than expected. Public bathhouses did exist, but they were more social club than sanitation station. People went to gossip, flirt, and occasionally bathe, though not necessarily in that order. And if you were really fancy, you might have a wooden tub at home, filled by servants who heated water over a fire and poured it in by hand. A process so tedious, most folks decided it wasn't worth the effort unless they were trying to impress a visiting bishop. Peasants, ironically, bathed more often than nobles. They had rivers, ponds, and fewer layers of silk to worry about. But even they weren't immune to the fear of waterborne curses. A quick splash to the face, a rinse of the feet, and that was usually enough to keep the demons at bay. So tonight, as you lie in your clean sheets, freshly showered and blissfully unhaunted by medieval hygiene fears, take a moment to appreciate the modern miracle of hot water on demand. And remember, in the Middle Ages, smelling like a bouquet of questionable herbs was considered peak cleanliness. Sleep tight, and may your pores remain safely closed. Ah, the call of nature. That timeless, universal moment when one must excuse oneself to, well, you know. In the Middle Ages, this was less a private affair and more a public performance, minus the applause. Let's start with the chamber pot, a humble bowl, often ceramic, sometimes metal, occasionally decorative, because why not? And always strategically placed under the bed or in the corner of the room. It was the medieval answer to indoor plumbing, except it didn't flush, it didn't hide, and it definitely didn't smell like lavender. Using it was simple. Squat aim, hope for the best. Emptying it, that was someone else's problem. Usually a servant, or, in some cases, a very unlucky younger sibling. The pot might be tossed out the window with a casual guard as low. French for watch out for the water, which was less a warning and more a polite way of saying incoming. Now, if you were out and about, you might find yourself at a public latrine. These were communal, open near, and about as private as a town square dance. Picture a long wooden bench with holes perched over a pit. No walls, no doors, just you, your neighbors, and the gentle sound of shared digestion. And then there was the spongonistic. Yes, it's real. In some bathhouses and latrines, a communal sponge was attached to a stick and used for cleaning up after business. It was rinsed in a bucket of water and reused. Let that word echo softly in your mind as you snuggle deeper into your hygienic haven. Toilet paper, not a thing. Leaves, moss, scraps of cloth, or if you were fancy old pages from books no one wanted to read. The truly elite might use wool. The truly desperate might use nothing and simply hope for a strong breeze. Etiquette was important, though. One did not speak while squatting. One did not make eye contact. And one certainly did not linger. The goal was efficiency, discretion, and minimal splash radius. So tonight, as you lie in your cozy bed, perhaps with a bathroom mirror, step away. Take a moment to appreciate the miracle of plumbing, privacy, and personal sponges. The Middle Ages may have had castles and knights, but they also had chamber pots and sponge sticks. Sleep well, and may your dreams be free of communal latrines. If you've ever skipped a shower and hoped a spritz of deodorant would save the day, congratulations, you've channeled your inner medieval noble. In the Middle Ages, soap was not the star of the hygiene show. It was more like the understudy who occasionally got called in when things got dire. The real MVP, perfume, scented oils, herbal sachets, anything that could mask the fact that you hadn't bathed since the last lunar eclipse. Let's start with the basics. Soap existed, but it was harsh. Made from animal fat and lye, it could strip the skin faster than a knight's lance in a jousting match. So most folks avoided it unless they were trying to exfoliate their sins. Instead, they turned to nature's bouquet. Rosewater was a favorite, dabbed behind the ears, splashed on the wrists, and occasionally poured into bathwater. If one was feeling particularly decadent, lavender, mint, and rosemary were also popular, not just for their scent, but for their alleged ability to ward off evil spirits and nose-wrinkling odors. Clothing was often perfumed too. Nobles would tuck scented sachets into their sleeves, collars, and even their shoes. Because nothing says, "I'm clean," like a foot that smells, faintly, of time. And then there were pomander's little balls filled with aromatic or carried in hand. They were the medieval version of a portable air freshener, minus the plastic casing and lemon scent. Some were so elaborate they looked like jewelry, which was helpful when you were trying to distract from the fact that you hadn't tea-bathed since Lent. Of course, not everyone could afford such luxuries. Peasants made do with what they had, rubbing themselves with vinegar, hanging bundles of herbs in their homes, or simply embracing the natural musk of hard labor and livestock proximity. But the goal was the same: smell good enough to fool your neighbors, your priest, and possibly your horse. So tonight, as you drift off in your freshly laundered pajamas, perhaps with a hint of lavender on your pillow, take a moment to appreciate the modern miracle of soap that doesn't double as paint stripper. And remember, in the Middle Ages, smelling nice was less about cleanliness and more about creative deception. Sleep sweetly, and may your dreams be scented with roses, not regret. Let's talk self-care. Today, it's bubble baths, scented candles, and face masks that make you look like a glamorous swamped creature. In the Middle Ages, it was vinegar baths, lice combs, and laundry that doubled as public entertainment. Let's begin with lice. Not the metaphorical kind, the actual, crawling, scalp-loving kind. They were so common, they practically had names. Nobles, peasants, monks, no one was safe. Lice were the great equalizer, the tiny tyrants of medieval hairdos. To combat them, people used fine-toothed combs carved from bone or wood. These combs were prized possessions, passed down like heirlooms. A good lice comb was worth its weight in gold ore, at least in fewer scalp itches. Some folks even wore herbs in their hair, hoping the scent would repel the little beasts. Spoiler, it didn't. Now, laundry. You might imagine medieval folk scrubbing clothes in secret behind castle walls. Nope. Laundry was a public affair. Women gathered at rivers, wells, and communal washhouses, armed with soapwood, a plant that foams when agitated, wooden paddles, and enough gossip to fuel a week's worth of scandal. Clothes were beaten, boiled, and hung to dry in the open air. Underwear, tunics, and even the occasional codpiece flapped proudly in the breeze. It was less delicate cycle and more aggressive purification ritual. And then there were vinegar baths. Yes, vinegar. The same stuff you put on chips. People believed it could cleanse the body, ward off disease, and maybe even scare away demons. A soak in vinegar was considered refreshing if you ignored the stinging, the smell, and the lingering scent of salad dressing, tooth care, burnt rosemary rubbed on the teeth, deodorant, a dab of alum, or a spritz of herbal tincture, hair care, animal fat, if you were brave, or just a hat. So tonight, as you lie in your clean sheets, perhaps freshly showered and blissfully lice-free, take a moment to appreciate the evolution of self-care. The Middle Ages may not have had bath bombs, but they had vinegar. And that counts for something. Sleep soundly. And may your dreams be free of paddles, parasites, and pungent potions. Rise and shine, sleepy traveler. It's breakfast time in the Middle Ages, and no, there's no coffee, but there is ale. Lots of it, because nothing says good morning like a pint of lukewarm beer and a questionable slab of meat. Let's start with the water situation. Medieval water was ambitious. It came from rivers, wells, and streams that doubled as laundry stations, latrines, and occasionally graveyards. Drinking it was a gamble like Russian roulette, but with dysentery. So people turned to ale. It was boiled during brewing, which killed off most of the nasties. It was low in alcohol, high in hydration, and socially acceptable to drink at breakfast, lunch, dinner, and any moment in between. Even children drank it, because nothing builds character like a toddler with a tankard. Now, onto the meat. Refrigeration hadn't been invented, and ice was reserved for nobles and snowball fights. So meat was salted, smoked, dried, or if all else failed, served with a generous helping of denial. Enter spices. Expensive, exotic, and absolutely essential. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg weren't just flavor enhancers, they were medieval meat disguises. A heavily spiced dish meant one of two things. You were rich, or the meat was auditioning for a role in a horror film. Fish was common, especially on religious fasting days. Eel was a favorite, lippery, boneless, and weirdly abundant. It was baked, boiled, jellied, and occasionally turned into pie. Yes, eel pie, a dish that sounds like a dare and tastes like regret. Bread was the backbone of every meal, but not all bread was created equal. Nobles got fine white loaves made from sifted flour. Peasants got coarse, dark bread full of bran, grit, and the occasional surprise pebble. Chewing it was a workout. Swallowing it was a commitment. So tonight, as you drift off with a full belly, hopefully not of eel, take a moment to appreciate the miracle of clean water, fresh food, and spices that don't have to hide the truth. The Middle Ages may have had feasts, but they also had fermented breakfasts and meat that needed a prayer. Sleep well, and may your dreams be seasoned, not suspicious. If you've ever looked at an eel and thought, that looks delicious, congratulations, you may have been a medieval chef, or possibly possessed. Either way, you'd fit right in. Eels were the unsung heroes of medieval cuisine. Slippery, boneless, and weirdly versatile, they slithered their way onto noble tables, peasant platters, and monastery menus with alarming frequency. Why? Because they were everywhere. Rivers, lakes, moats. If it had water, it probably had eels. And if it had eels, someone was definitely planning to eat them. They were considered a delicacy, especially during religious fasting days when meat was forbidden. But fish was fair game. And since eels technically counted as fish, despite looking like a cursed noodle, they became the go-to loophole for hungry monks and pious nobles alike. Eel pie was a thing, a real thing. Imagine a flaky crust filled with chopped, seasoned eel, sometimes mixed with herbs, sometimes with regret. It was served hot, cold, or jellied, because nothing says bon appétit like a gelatinous tube of aquatic mystery. There were eel stews, eel fritters, eel pastes, and even eel puddings. Some recipes called for boiling them in ale. Others suggested roasting them over an open flame, while whispering prayers to Saint Eelbert. Not a real saint, but he should be. And let's not forget the eel economy. In some regions, eels were used as rent payments. Landlords accepted barrels of eels in lieu of coins. Which means somewhere out there, a medieval accountant had to calculate interest in slippery units. But not everyone was thrilled. Some folks found eels suspicious, too boneless, too wriggly, too likely to escape meal. There were rumors they could crawl out of pans, slither across tables, and haunt your dreams, which, frankly, makes them the perfect bedtime topic. So tonight, as you snuggle into your eel-free bed, take a moment to appreciate the modern miracle of food that doesn't squirm. The Middle Ages may have loved their eels, but you, dear sleeper, are safe from surprise seafood. Sleep soundly, and may your dreams be boneless and blissfully bland. Picture this. You're at a medieval banquet. The roast boar is steaming, the eel pie is jiggling, and the wine is flowing like someone forgot to pay the plumbing bill. You reach for your forehand suddenly. The room gasps. A monk faints. A noble clutches his pearls. Someone whispers, "Heretic." Welcome to the Middle Ages, where forks were not just frowned upon, they were practically forbidden. Why? Because fingers were considered the proper tools for eating. God gave you 10 utensils, and by medieval logic, that was plenty. Forks were foreign, suspicious, and vaguely sinful. They came from Byzantium, where people were already weird enough with their spices and indoor plumbing. Early forks had 2 tines and looked like tiny pitchforks, which didn't help their reputation. Using one was seen as prideful, decadent, and possibly demonic. After all, who needs a miniature trident to stab a turnip? Instead, people used knives, big ones, sharp ones, sometimes the same knife for eating, hunting, and settling disputes. Spoons were acceptable, especially for soups and porridges, but forks were for the morally questionable, even when forks did sneak onto noble tables. They were used sparingly, maybe for sticky sweets, maybe for spearing slippery eels, but never for bread. Bread was sacred. Bread was finger food. Bread was the medieval napkin, plate, and sponge all rolled into one. Table manners were flexible. Slurping was common. Elbows were everywhere. Burping was considered a compliment. And if you dropped something, you simply picked it up and kept going, unless it was your dignity. In which case, you left it under the table and moved on. Banquets were loud, messy, and gloriously chaotic. Dogs wandered underfoot. Minstrels sang about questionable topics, and someone always spilled something on someone else. It was less Downton Abbey and more medieval food fight with better costumes. So tonight, as you lie in your clean bed, perhaps with a fork resting peacefully in your kitchen drawer, take a moment to appreciate the modern miracle of utensil acceptance. The Middle Ages may have feared forks, but you, dear sleeper, are free to stab your salad in peace. Sleep well, and may your dreams be properly plated and politely portioned. In the medieval world, bread wasn't just bread. It was a social statement, a ranking system, a culinary caste code. And if you didn't know your manchette from your trencher, you might accidentally eat the table. Let's start at the top. Manchat bread. Soft, white, and made from finely sifted flour. This was the good stuff, reserved for nobles, bishops, and anyone who could afford to have their wheat pampered like a spa guest. Eating manchet meant you were important, or at least pretending convincingly. Then came cheap bread. Slightly coarser, slightly darker, and slightly less impressive. This was middle-class bread, the kind you'd serve to a merchant or a minor knight. It said, "I'm doing okay, but I still reuse my candle stubs. And finally, brown bread, dense, dark, and full of mystery grains. This was peasant fare. It could double as a doorstop, a weapon, or a pillow in emergencies. It was nutritious, yes, but also a clear sign you weren't invited to the fancy banquet upstairs. But the real star of medieval dining wasn't even meant to be eaten. The trencher, a thick slab of stale bread used as a plate. You'd pile your food on it, let the juices soak in, and then, if you were feeling generous, give it to the poor afterward. Because nothing says charity like a gravy-soaked bread disc. Banquets themselves were theatrical affairs. The more courses, the more power. A king might host a feast with 5 removes, each containing multiple dishes. Think roast swan, peacock pie, and something suspiciously gelatinous. Meanwhile, the peasants were lucky to get a turnip stew and a communal onion. Seating mattered too. The closer you were to the salt cellar, the higher your status. Above the salt meant you were someone. Below the salt meant you were someone's cousin's goat handler. And let's not forget the entertainment. Jesters, jugglers, musicians, and occasionally a man who could burp the alphabet in Latin. Banquets were sensory overload site. Sound, smell, and the occasional sword fight over who got the last honeyed fig. So tonight, as you nibble your midnight snack or dream of crusty kingdoms, remember, bread was never just bread. It was identity, hierarchy, and hospitality all rolled into one. Sleep tight, noble dreamer. May your dreams be soft as manchet and never below the salt. History likes to paint royalty as poised, polished, and perpetually perfumed. But behind the velvet curtains and golden goblets lurked a truth too pungent for polite society. Nobles farted, loudly, frequently, and sometimes with political consequences. Take Edward II of England, who was once mocked in courtly poems, not just for his questionable leadership, but for his windy disposition. His enemies claimed his speeches were long-winded in more ways than one. Or Emperor Elagabalus of Rome, who reportedly held dinner parties where guests were seated based on how amusing their bodily noises were. If your burp didn't get a laugh, your seat got downgraded. If your fart caused a riot, you got dessert first. In medieval courts, flatulence was both feared and weaponized. Feast-induced gas was common thanks to rich meats, heavy ales, and a suspicious lack of vegetables. But letting one slip in the wrong company could be a diplomatic disaster. One poor knight in Burgundy allegedly passed gas during a toast to the Queen. He was banished not for treason, but for audible disrespect. The chronicles don't say whether it was a trumpet or a whisper, but the punishment was swift. Meanwhile, court jesters often used flatulence as part of their act. Some were trained in controlled release, turning bodily functions into punchlines. One legendary performer, Roland the Farter, gifted land for his annual Christmas performance. A jump, a whistle, and a fart. That's right, he was literally paid to toot on cue. Even etiquette manuals had to tiptoe around the issue. A 15th century guide advised nobles to excuse oneself discreetly should nature call from below. Translation: if you must fart, do it like a gentleman, preferably behind a tapestry. But not all gas was shameful. In some cultures, it was seen as a sign of satisfaction. A hearty belch or a post-feast toot meant the host had succeeded. In others, it was blamed on demons, bad humors, or the peasants. So tonight, as you lie in bed and your stomach gurgles from that extra helping of biryani, remember, even kings had gas. Even queens had bloated days, and even the most majestic monarchs occasionally cleared a room. Sleep soundly, noble dreamer, and if you must pass wind in your sleep, may it be as dignified as Roland's Christmas. If you've ever wondered what a medieval town smelled like, imagine a blend of horse sweat, fish guts, incense, and existential dread. Hygiene was interpretive, and while some folks bathed with surprising regularity, others believed water was a gateway to sin or worse, pneumonia. Let's start with the myth. Medieval people never bathed. Not entirely true. Public bathhouses were common in many cities, especially in the early Middle Ages. People soaked, scrubbed, and socialized in warm tubs. Some bathhouses even offered snacks, music, and extra services, which is why the church eventually frowned upon them. But as time went on, bathing fell out of favor. By the 14th century, doctors warned that hot water opened the pores and let disease in. Better to stay dry, they said. Better to layer your filth like a protective crust. Instead of bathing, nobles turned to dry hygiene. They changed their linen shirts often, believing the fabric absorbed sweat and sin. They powdered their hair with scented starch. They carried pomander's little balls of herbs and spices, to sniff when the peasants got too pungent. Peasants, meanwhile, bathed in rivers when they could, or they didn't. Their hygiene was practical. Wash your hands before eating. Rinse your feet if they're muddy. And if your shirt stands up on its own, maybe it's time to boil it. Tooth care. 2 mint leaves. Rub your teeth with burnt rosemary. Or just accept that everyone had breath that could fell a dragon. Hair care. Use lard or beer. Or a mixture of vinegar and crushed herbs. Bonus: it repelled lice and suitors equally. And then there were the saints. Some were said to smell sweet even in death. Saint Catherine of Siena reportedly emitted a floral scent despite never bathing. Her holiness was so potent, it overpowered her hygiene. That's divine deodorant. But not everyone was so lucky. King Louis IX of France bathed twice a year and was considered a paragon of cleanliness. Twice, that was luxury. That was scandalous. That was borderline obsessive. So tonight, as you lie in your clean sheets, perhaps freshly showered and blissfully lice-free, remember, medieval hygiene was a spectrum. From saintly sense to stable stench, everyone did their best with what they had on. Sleep well, fragrant dreamer. May your dreams be lavender scented and free of medieval foot fungus. If you had a cough in the Middle Ages, you didn't reach for lozenges, you reached for a live toad, preferably one that looked judgmental. Because, according to some healers, placing a toad on your chest could draw out the illness. Bonus points if it croaked in Latin. Welcome to medieval medicine, a swirling cauldron of herbal wisdom, divine intervention, and pure, unfiltered guesswork. Let's start with the basics. The dominant theory was humorism, not the funny kind, but the bodily fluid kind. Health depended on the balance of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you were sick, one of them was misbehaving. The cure: bleed you, or purge you, or make you sniff a goat's armpit. Yes, that was a thing. Common remedies included leeches, for when you had too much blood and not enough drama. Urine analysis. Doctors would taste it. Yes, taste. Notes of asparagus and regret. Herbal poultices made from lavender, rosemary, or whatever was growing near the latrine. Amulets worn to ward off evil spirits, bad humors, and nosy neighbors. Then there were the witchy curesfolk remedies passed down through generations. Some worked, some didn't. Some involved burying a dead mole under the full moon while chanting about turnips for toothaches. Burn a pig's tooth and inhale the smoke. For baldness, rub your scalp with chicken fat and hope for divine mercy. For insomnia, drink warm ale with crushed poppy seeds and pray you don't wake up in 1327. Doctors were often monks, barbers, or enthusiastic amateurs. The barber surgeon could cut your hair, lance your boils, and remove your sola before lunch. Medical schools existed, but their curriculum was heavy on astrology and light on anatomy. And let's not forget the plague cures. During outbreaks, people wore beaked masks filled with herbs, whipped themselves in public, or blamed the local baker's cat. Spoiler, none of it worked. But amidst the madness, some treatments were surprisingly effective. Honey was used as an antiseptic. Willow bark, a precursor to aspirin, eased pain, and garlic, a medieval superfood. So tonight, as you drift off with your modern medicine safely tucked in the cabinet, remember, medieval folks did their best with frogs, herbs, and a whole lot of hope. Sleep soundly, brave dreamer. And may your dreams be free of leeches, bile, and unsolicited mole rituals. Saints are often imagined as serene figures floating through life with glowing halos and impeccable manners. But medieval saints, they were wild, they were weird. They were walking contradictions wrapped in incense and mystery. Take Saint Simeon Stylites, who lived on top of a pillar for 37 years. Not a metaphorical pilloral, literal one. He perched their rain or shine, preaching to passers-by and occasionally lowering a bucket for food. Hygiene questionable, commitment unmatched. Or Saint Wilgefortis, the bearded lady saint. According to legend, she prayed to avoid an unwanted marriage, and God answered by giving her a full beard. Her suitor fled, she was martyred, and she became the patron saint of women seeking independence, possibly razors. Then there's Saint Joseph of Cupertino, who reportedly levitated during prayer. Not once, not twice, but so often that monks had to tie him down. He was banned from choir practice because his floating distracted the other singers. Some saints were scandalously generous. Saint Francis of Assisi stripped naked in public to renounce his wealth. The bishop had to cover him with a curtain. It was the medieval version of I quit with bonus nudity. Others were scandalously stubborn. Saint Catherine of Alexandria debated 50 pagan philosophers and won. She was sentenced to death by spiked wheel, but it broke on contact. So they beheaded her instead. The wheel became her symbol, and a medieval carnival ride was never the same. And let's not forget Saint Christina the Astonishing, who once levitated during her own funeral, declared everyone sinful, and flew into the rafters. She later lived in graveyards, bathed in freezing rivers, and was somehow canonized. Astonishing, indeed. Saints were also known for their miraculous smells. Some emitted floral scents upon death. Others made their tombs smell like cinnamon. One saint's corpse reportedly smelled so good, pilgrims came just to sniff it. Medieval aromatherapy at its finest. But sainthood wasn't just about miracles. It was about marketing. Relics were a big business. A saint's toe bone could draw crowds. A vial of saintly blood. Instant tourism. Churches competed for the best relics, sometimes acquiring multiple skulls of the same saint. Math was flexible. Faith was fierce. So tonight, as you lie in bed, perhaps pondering your own path to holiness, remember, sainthood wasn't always serene. Sometimes it involved pillars, beards, levitation, and a healthy dose of medieval chaos. Sleep well, blessed dreamer, and may your dreams be weirdly holy and divinely entertaining. Forget roses and candlelit dinners. In the Middle Ages, love was a battlefield, and The weapons were potions, charms, and questionable advice from your local hedge. Let's start with the love potion. A classic blend of herbs, animal bits, and desperation. Recipes varied wildly, but common ingredients included crushed worms for passion, dried rose petals for beauty, powdered antlers for virility, a dash of menstrual blood for commitment. These potions were brewed in secret, often by women who knew more about herbs than the village doctor. Some were meant to be drunk. Others were sprinkled on clothing. A few were buried under the target's doorstep while chanting, "Come to me, oh sweaty night." Tiny charms worn to attract love or ward off rivals. One popular talisman was a dried frog sewn into a pouch with lavender and hair clippings. Romantic? No. Effective? Debatable. Smelly? Absolutely. Medieval love advice was equally chaotic. A 14th century guide suggested, to win a maiden's heart, gift her a mirror and a comb. Make a man fall in love, feed him fennel, and stare at him through a keyhole. To ensure fidelity, rub his shoes with nettles and whisper your name into his pillow. Courtship rituals were elaborate. Nobles exchanged poems, embroidered tokens, and sometimes entire castles. Peasants exchanged bread, goats, and promises they couldn't keep. Everyone exchanged glances, some longing, some suspicious, some just trying to figure out who smelled like onions. And then came romantic mishaps. One knight accidentally wooed the wrong lady by sending his love letter to her sister. A monk fell in love with a nun, disguised himself as a gardener, and was caught when he tried to baptize a turnip. A noblewoman used a love potion on her husband, only to discover he preferred the stable boy. Love was messy, forbidden, dramatic, and occasionally fatal. Some romances ended in exile, others in poetry, a few in very awkward family dinners. But amidst the chaos, there were genuine moments of tenderness. A peasant carving his beloved's name into a tree. A queen writing secret letters to her imprisoned king. A bard composing a song so sweet it made a duchess cry into her porridge. So, tonight, as you drift off with your heart intact and your worm-free tea beside you, remember, medieval love was wild, weird, and wonderfully human. Sleep well, romantic dreamer, and may your dreams be potion-free and full of consensual courtship. Forget your cushy desk job or artisanal sourdough side hustle. In the Middle Ages, employment was a gritty, grimy, and often gut-wrenching affair. If you weren't born noble, your career options ranged from mildly unpleasant to please pass the plague mask. Let's start with the gong farmer. This brave soul was responsible for cleaning out latrines, cesspits, and anything that smelled like regret. Gong was a polite word for human waste. Farmers of it worked at night, armed with shovels, buckets, and a tolerance for horror. They were paid well because no one else wanted the job. But they were also banned from polite society. You could shovel poop, but you couldn't sit near the bishop. Then there was the royal butt wiper, officially known as the groom of the stool. This wasn't a joke, it was a prestigious position. The groom assisted the king during his most private moments, managing his toileting needs and keeping records of bowel movements. Yes, there were logs of logs. The job required discretion, loyalty, and a strong stomach. Oddly enough, it came with political influence. If you're wiping the king's bottom, you're also whispering in his ear. Other medieval jobs included rat catcher, armed with traps, terriers, and a deep hatred of rodents. Bonus, you got to wear a badge shaped like a rat. Fuller cleaned wool by stomping on it in vats of urine. The ammonia helped. The smell didn't. Tumbler, a traveling acrobat who performed for coins, chickens, or vague promises. Injuries were frequent. Applause was optional. Senator, hired to eat bread over a corpse to absorb its sins. You got paid in food and eternal damnation. Even noble jobs had their downsides. Court musicians had to play on command, even during royal tantrums. Scribes went blind, copying texts by candlelight. Falconers spent their days with birds that hated them. And messengers risked death if they delivered bad news with the wrong tone. But not all jobs were terrible. Alewives brewed beer and ran taverns. Herbalists mixed potions and cured ailments. Jesters got away with insults disguised as jokes. And millers, though often accused of cheating, had steady income and excellent thighs. So tonight, as you lie in your clean bed, perhaps employed in something that doesn't involve feces or falcons, take a moment to appreciate your modern career. Medieval workers walked so you could zoom. Sleep well, industrious dreamer, and may your dreams be free of cesspits, stools, and suspicious vats. If you think your cat is dramatic, your dog is spoiled, or your goldfish has attitude, congratulations, you're in excellent company. Medieval folks adored animals. They pampered them, paraded them, and occasionally gave them jobs they didn't ask for. Kings and queens kept exotic animals to show off their wealth and confuse their guests. Henry III of England had a pet polar bear. It lived in the Tower of London and was allowed to swim in the Thames on a leash, because nothing says power like walking your bear by the river. Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire kept cheetahs, elephants, and a parrot that spoke multiple languages. The parrot was arguably the most qualified member of his court. Then there were squirrel leashes. Yes, leashes. Tiny velvet harnesses for pet squirrels, often worn by noble women as fashion accessories. The squirrels sat on shoulders, nibbled on nuts, and occasionally launched surprise attacks on nearby courtiers. Dogs were everywhere. Big ones guarded castles. Small ones warmed laps. Some were trained to turn meat spits over the fire, a job that required patience, paw strength, and a deep love of roast duck. Cats were both beloved and feared. They kept mice away, curled up in monasteries, and occasionally got accused of witchcraft. Black cats were especially suspicious. If your cat stared too long at a candle, someone might call the bishop. Birds were status symbols. Falcons were trained for hunting and wore tiny hoods to keep them calm. Parrots were taught to curse in Latin. Peacocks were kept for their beauty and occasionally served at banquets, feathers and all. Even pigs had their moment. Some were kept as pets, others as walking snacks. One pig in France was put on trial for murder. It was found guilty, dressed in human clothes, and executed. Justice was creative. And let's not forget the pet monkeys, tiny, mischievous, and often dressed in miniature outfits. They were the medieval version of chaos in a waistcoat. One nobleman's monkey reportedly stole his ring, climbed a tapestry, and refused to come down until bribed with figs. So tonight, as you snuggle your own furry companion, or simply dream of one, remember, medieval pets were wild, weird, and wonderfully loved. Whether they wore armor, spoke Latin, or turned meat spits, they made life a little less grim. Sleep well, animal-loving dreamer. And may your dreams be filled with squirrel leashes and parrot poetry. In the medieval mind, the world was a delicate balance of divine order and lurking chaos. And nothing disrupted that balance quite like upside-down bread. Yes, bread, the sacred carb. If you placed a loaf upside down, flat side up, crust side down, it was believed to invite the devil to dinner. Bakers were warned never to do it, lest their ovens become portals to hell. Some even carved crosses into loaves to keep evil spirits from hitching a ride. But bread was just the beginning. Everyday objects, supernatural consequences, mirrors, were dangerous. Breaking one didn't just mean 7 years of bad luck, it meant your soul might be fractured. People covered mirrors during storms to prevent lightning from striking through the glass and dragging ghosts into the house. Shoes on the table, instant death omen, especially if they were new. It was believed to tempt fate, mock the dead, or insult the spirits who lived under the floorboards. Yes, floorboard spirits were a thing. Spilled salt had to be thrown over your left shoulder. Why the left? Because that's where the devil lurked, waiting to snatch your soul while you were seasoning your stew. Nighttime nonsense. Sleeping with your feet facing the door was a no-no. That's how corpses were carried out, so doing it while alive was seen as inviting death to come knock. Owls hooting at night meant someone nearby would die, unless you bribed the owl with bread. Right side up, obviously, itchy palms meant money was coming, unless it was your left palm. Then money was leaving, unless you rubbed it on wood. Then it might stay. Maybe animal antics, black cats were witches in disguise, or their familiars, or just unlucky. Unless they crossed your path from the right, then they were fine. Unless it was a Tuesday, toads were walking curses. Touch one, and you might get warts, or visions, or both. Some believe toads carried the souls of sinners. Others just thought they were rude. Crows were messengers of doom. 3 crows meant death. 4 meant war. 5 meant taxes. 6 meant you were just having a bad day. Bonus: the bread ritual in some villages. If someone fell ill mysteriously, they'd perform the bread test. A loaf was baked with the suspected person's name carved into it. If the loaf cracked strangely or refused to rise, the person was guilty of witchcraft. If it baked normally, they were probably still guilty, but at least the bread was edible. If you've ever skipped a shower and justified it with "I am preserving my natural oils," congratulations, you're halfway to medieval nobility. Because in the Middle Ages, bathing wasn't just rare, it was suspicious. Doctors warned that hot water opened the pores, making the body vulnerable to disease, demons, and possibly bad poetry. A warm bath could cleanse your sins or invite the plague. Opinions varied, mostly depending on how recently someone had died from bathing. Public bathhouses did exist, especially in early medieval cities. They were lively places where people soaked, gossiped, and occasionally got a little too friendly. Eventually, the church frowned upon them not for hygiene reasons, but because they were basically medieval tinder with steam. Nobles preferred dry cleaning, not the modern kind. The change your linen shirt and pretend you're clean kind. Change it often enough, and you'd be spiritually spotless even if you smelled like a fermented goat. Peasants bathed when they could. Rivers, ponds, and rainstorms were fair game. Soap was homemade, harsh, and used sparingly. Hair was washed with vinegar or ale. Skin was scrubbed with sand, herbs, or just sheer willpower. But the real gem of medieval hygiene, tooth care, toothpaste didn't exist. Toothbrushes were twigs. And the go-to remedy for dental decay, burnt mouse. Yes, mouse, listen. Catch one, roast it, grind it into powder, and rub it on your teeth. The logic: mice had strong teeth. Maybe their ashes would transfer that strength. Maybe not. But it was worth a try. Other dental options included crushed rosemary for freshness and mild regret, salt and vinegar, for pain and punishment, charcoal for whitening and existential dread. And if your teeth fell out, no problem, just smile less or become a monk. Deodorant was equally experimental. Some used alum, others used herbs. A few brave souls rubbed their armpits with crushed mint and hoped for divine intervention. So tonight, as you lie in your clean bed, perhaps freshly showered and blissfully mouse-free, take a moment to appreciate the miracle of modern hygiene. The Middle Ages may have feared baths, but you, dear sleeper, are safe in your sudsy sanctuary. Sleep well, sparkling dreamer, and may your dreams be minty, mouse-free, and medically sound. If you think medieval folks spent all their time plowing fields and dodging plagues, think again. They knew how to party just with fewer disco balls and more accidental injuries. Jousting, the original extreme sport, imagined two armored men on horses, charging at each other with long sticks, trying to knock each other into next week. That's jousting. It was a noble pastime, a public spectacle, a great way to lose teeth. Knights trained for years to master the art of not dying dramatically. The goal wasn't just to win it, was to impress the crowd, earn glory, and maybe catch the eye of a noble lady who appreciated a good concussion. Jousting tournaments were like medieval Coachella, minus the music and hydration. Vendors sold meat pies, minstrels played, and peasants cheered while trying not to get trampled. Jesters, the licensed lunatics jesters, weren't just clowns. They were sharp-tongued satirists with bells on their hats and permission to mock the king legally. Their job was to entertain the court, speak uncomfortable truths with jokes, avoid execution. They juggled, danced, sang, and roasted nobles with impunity. A good jester could make a king laugh. A great jester could make him rethink his tax policy. A bad jester, let's just say the dungeon had decent acoustics. Some jesters were disabled or had unique appearances which added to their mystique. Others were brilliant wordsmiths who used humor to survive in a world where sarcasm could be fatal. Public napping, the forgotten art. Medieval folks didn't have Netflix, but they had feasts, fairs, and festivals, and after a few hours of dancing, drinking, and dodging livestock, they'd just nap anywhere. Fields, benches, church pews. It was horizontal. It was fair game. Public napping was socially acceptable, often necessary, occasionally interrupted by goats during long sermons. People would doze off mid-prayer. At festivals, they'd collapse in haystacks. It was the medieval version of power napping, minus the power and plus a lot of snoring. Medieval music entertainment also meant music played on instruments like lutes. Medieval guitars with commitment issues. Hurdy-gurdies. Imagine a violin and a crank had a noisy child. Bagpipes used both for celebration and psychological warfare. Songs ranged from religious chants to bawdy ballads about ale, love, and livestock. If you could rhyme and didn't smell too bad, you were halfway to being a bard. In the Middle Ages, medicine was equal parts guesswork, superstition, and bold experimentation. If you were sick, the cure might involve bloodletting, bread, mold, or a hole in your skull. Leeches. The medieval cure-all doctors believed illness came from imbalanced humors. The fix: remove blood, preferably via leeches. These squishy vampires were applied liberally, often with alarming enthusiasm. Trepanation, open-minded surgery to treat headaches or evil spirits. Healers drilled holes in skulls. No anesthesia, just faith and a chisel. Some survived, others became legends. Moldy bread, accidental antibiotic before penicillin. Moldy bread was slapped on wounds. It sometimes worked. It always smelled. But better than goat dung poultices. Yes, those were real. Bonus oddities. Spider webs for bleeding boiled owl broth for epilepsy astrology. To schedule surgeries, hospitals were more spiritual than sterile. If you walked out alive, it was considered a miracle. If not, well, prayers were included. After 19 chapters of scandalous queens, cursed brothels, and questionable medical practices, it's time to reflect. Because beneath the absurdity, medieval life was a masterclass in resilience, creativity, and really committing to bad ideas. Here are a few timeless truths we've uncovered. 1. Curiosity survives everything. Whether it was monks inventing clocks or peasants debating theology over turnips, medieval folks were endlessly inquisitive. Even if the answers involve leeches. 2. Humor is a survival tool from farting jesters to passive-aggressive gravestones. Medieval people knew how to laugh through plague, poverty, and papal drama. A good joke was worth its weight in mead. 3. Rituals matter. Whether dancing to ward off death or whispering to bread dough, rituals gave life rhythm. Even the weird ones, especially the weird ones. 4. History is wild, but so are we. We've traded goat dung poultices for TikTok trends, but the impulse to experiment, connect, and tell stories, that's eternal. So, if you've made it this far, dear listener, you're officially a time-traveling legend. You've survived medieval scandals, slept through royal drama, and learned that bread mold might save your life. If you enjoyed this strange and soothing journey through the past, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with fellow night owls, history nerds, and anyone who needs a laugh before bed. Thanks for dreaming with me. Good night, and may your leeches be few and your stories be many.